the LSE. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce you this evening an Emeritus Professor in International Relations, Professor Michael Cox, who is also now the Head of IDEAS at the LSE. And the title of his talk this evening is The Kindness of Strangers. So, no more ado, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming along. You had to get past Ukraine and Taiwan on the way up, I noticed, so I'm pleased you were right here. The story I'm going to relate this evening concerning what became known as the Academic Assistance Council is about one very small part of a much larger tragedy that played itself out in Europe between 1933 and 1945, with consequences we know only too well. Millions dead, lives broken, families destroyed, cities annihilated, and of course the near total destruction of European Jewry. And at the end of it all, a long Cold War which divided Europe for 40 years. But as I will show, it is also a story about hope and endeavour, of decency and kindness. It is also a story which features one man in particular, William Beveridge, who was the 4th director of LSE here at the school between 1919 and 1937. But it's also a story that includes a really quite extraordinary cast of people in Britain at the time, both here and abroad after 1933, beyond Beveridge. Central, though, I think I will show his role was on the Academic Assistance Council. There is, for example, the role played by another future director of the LSE, a man known to some here, should be known as Walter Adams. Walter Adams, who acted as secretary to the council after 1933 until 1938. Of course, very controversial later in the 60s when he was appointed here at the LSE because he came from the University of Rhodesia. It precipitated some of the troubles here. But Adams was a liberal, and a very good one at that. And his reputation needs to be rescued from those who had attacked him in the 1960s, I think. There is also, of course, the formidable world historical figure of Albert Einstein, who spoke to a packed Albert Hall on behalf of the council. 5,000 people turned up to listen to Einstein make the plea. There are also numerous scientists, and they figure in this story very much, including Rutherford, the great Rutherford, A.V. Hall, P.M. Blackett, and many more besides, including F.A. Lindemann, who became Churchill's scientific advisor, always known as the Prof. The most powerful scientist ever, as somebody once put it, Churchill's personal technocrat, and a close friend of the old man. There is also, of course, the extraordinary, and he will figure in the story as well, and there's a series of stories. There's also the extraordinary Hungarian Jewish scientist Leo Zilliot, who played a major gadfly role in saving hundreds of mainly Jewish academics from fascism. The same Zilliot, by the way, who wrote to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939 about the military potential inherent in splitting the atom. And last but by no means least, there is a woman who has not so much been written out of history, but was for some time not fully recognised for the role she played. And this woman, of course, is Esther Citizen, an extraordinary person who effectively devoted her life after 1933, right into the 1950s, to saving strangers. She was, and I'll talk more about her later on, a really quite extraordinary human being. It is always said that she's the most forgotten woman in history, except I found one biography and at least 20 articles on her. So she's not forgotten now, even if she may have been ignored earlier. But before coming to talk about the council, about what it did and what it achieved, perhaps it's more important first to say something about what it brought it into being in the first place in the spring of 1933. And here we have to say, by definition, something about the rise of Nazism in Germany and what this meant for Germany as a whole and for German Jews in particular. Now, the deeper causes of Hitler's coming into office in the January of 1933 have been much discussed and much disputed by many historians over the years. You can take your pick. The banking crisis of 1931 and 32, which had an immediate effect on employment. And two of those banks were actually Jewish-owned or controlled, which made a difference, of course, to the rise of anti-Semitism. Mass unemployment, which followed that. The deep divide on the German left, with the communists against the Social Democrats and the Social Democrats against the communists. Short-sightedness of the German establishment in turning to Hitler, thinking they could control this silly little corporal from Austria. The German electoral system, which so divided German parties. The brutal audacity of the National Socialist Party, the NSDAP. The legacy of the hated Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, the Diktat, as it was called, and of course one of the first things Hitler did was to remove that. And the way, it has been argued by some historians going back even further, the way in which Germany was originally unified under Prussia in the 1870s. Some have even talked of a German national character. None of this need to take us too long here, but we need to make the point. Two things, however, are clear, and they do need to be stressed in this lecture. One, that Hitler was a revolutionary who was determined to push through a revolution on two fronts. One, directed against the status quo in Europe by any means possible, to make Germany great again, and two, to implement a totalitarian revolution in Germany itself, to remake Germany and to redefine what it meant to be German, which meant, by definition, defining the opposite, what it meant to be un-German. The latter, the un-Germans, included a long list. It included Marxists of all stripes, Social Democrats, independent trade unionists, homosexuals, Freemasons, Bohemians, and any free-thinking intellectuals. But top of the list clearly were the Jews, and all those deemed to be non-Aryan. As Michael Burley, who's now working in LSE IDEAS with us, has put it so well in a great book he wrote on Germany as a racial state, Hitler's purpose was not just to get Germany working again, but to create a racially cleansed state. And this meant removing all traces of Jewish life from Germany by all means possible. In this, it must be said that Hitler and his colleagues, comrades, was nothing if not utterly consistent. He'd always said he would do it. Read Mein Kampf. There have been studies done to trace the sources of Hitler's specific anti-Semitism, what made him an anti-Semite, what his experiences in Vienna after the war. He had, by the way, after all, fought along Jewish comrades in World War I in the trenches and never made a fuss then. One could go into all sorts of details of what made him one. No doubt useful. This is the point about anti-Semitism in Germany, particularly in Europe more generally, in the late 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century. Let's not forget the Dreyfus affair. Let's not forget what had been happening in Russia, or Poland, or Ukraine. This was not a Hitler problem, but something much deeper within Europe, within European society, which, of course, in turn, Hitler's party, the NSDAP, tapped into with enormous power and with enormous effectiveness. Indeed, for the National Socialists, not just for Hitler, the Jews, anti-Semitism was central for three reasons. It had been the Jews, they argued, that had stabbed Germany in the back in 1919. The German army was defeated. The German army, however, marched back into Berlin, fully equipped, apparently undefeated, but it had been. Why, therefore, did we get the Versailles Peace Treaty? Because Germany had been stabbed in the back by Bolsheviks and Marxists and Jews. and maybe they're one and the same thing. The Jews were also the source of Bolshevism. There was never any Nazi propaganda which didn't talk about Jewish Bolshevism. Bolsheviks as Jews. There was enough Jewish people in the Bolshevik Party like Trotsky and others to give some basis for that. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany in the Revolution of 1919. And, flipping the coin, they were also the finance capitalists who were sucking the blood of ordinary, decent Germans. It's no surprise, therefore, from the outset the NSDAP targeted all German Jews who in 1933, the figures vary, but this is the rough and ready accepted figure, numbers of Jews in Germany, German Jews, and I'll talk about what it meant to be a Jew and what was a Jew, because it's an interesting question. They numbered about 530,000 citizens, which was approximately 1% of the German population. It should be added straight away, by the way, that most of these people saw themselves as loyal Germans. There's a wonderful piece I've read, more German than the Germans. Many were assimilated into German life. 15,000 had converted to Christianity. Patriotic too. 12,000 definable, no, not easy to define German Jews, had died in the First World War in the trenches. Many had been awarded the Iron Cross. One famous German Jew who was forced out of Germany in the 30s threw his Iron Cross down at the Gauleiter, saying, I fought for this country and now you're forcing me out of it. 12,000 died fighting for a country they believed in. Indeed, overall, it has to be said, and this gets to the question of what was essentially a Jew, indeed, overall, German Jews were more or less completely assimilated into German life and culture. This is what made the shock of the Nazi taking power so total for them. They were loyal, in the main, patriotic Germans who believed they were Germans above all, had fought in the First World War, believed in Germany as a culture, believed in Germany as a scientific culture, as the place of reason, the place of great literature and of great philosophy. And now they were facing this particular onslaught from the mad Hitler. And of course also their contribution to German life until 1933 had been absolutely enormous, far outweighing their numbers in the population. In science, which I'll talk about in a while, in learning and in the economy. The simplest measure of this contribution is to see how many Nobel Prizes in science is an interesting indicator. Germany won before 1933. They won about 18. 5 or 6 of those were clearly German Jewish scientists. 1% of the population. And how few they won thereafter. That's the price that was paid. Furthermore, it became clear that as the Nazi attacks on the Jews intensified after Hitler assumed power in early 1933, and intensify they did, and I'll talk about that, there were warnings from business organisations, some of whom were benefiting from the expropriation of German businesses and German banks and German shops. Even they warned of the danger and the damage this was doing to the German economy. Number of businesses, you go through the literature of the time, warning, saying it's going to undermine and destroy the economy. And in the universities, of course, given the power and the influence and the importance of German Jewish intellectuals and academics, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, they warned here, this is going to destroy the academy. It has to be said, however, that some of the strongest supporters of the Nazi Party were students, and that some of the strongest advocates of this elimination of German Jewish academics from the universities, which began in 1933, was actually supported by German academics who believed they would either benefit from this or that you would remove Germans, or they just kept quiet because they were terrified. The silence of the feared, or the fearful. But all to no avail. Hitler said it didn't matter. We'll produce a proper German science, an Aryan science, a non-Jewish science. The campaign to drive the Jews, mainly the Jews, but not only, because there was also a political side to this as well, which included some Marxists and some leftists and free thinkers. The campaign to drive them out of Germany began straight away in early 1933. Remember, Hitler came to power into office in January. And it was this initial campaign and its consequences that caused the academic council we're talking about, to be created. Here, the most significant piece of Nazi legislation, and there were enormous amounts of legislation throughout the 30s directed against German Jews, and it got worse and worse and worse, as you know, as it went on, and more barbaric as time proceeded. It was not to be the last piece of legislation. It was announced in April 1933. Translated loosely, it's called the law, get this, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Innocuous enough in its sounding and in its words, but mighty dangerous in its consequence. According to it, civil servants, notice, who were active in opposition parties or had close ties to them could be dismissed. However, and this is the big however, the law was directed mainly at Jewish civil servants. And Article 3 of the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service stated that civil servants of, quote, non-Aryan descent should be put into retirement. Now remember, at this time, all academics in Germany were civil servants. They worked for the state. So therefore, this, what you might call in modern German, Berufsverbot, this was directed not just against civil servants as we would understand it, but all academics of a non-Aryan character working in universities, because they were, by definition, civil servants. In the following weeks, the circle of people affected by the law widened, and the family background of public employees, including the staff of state-run theatres, orchestras, and universities, which is the subject of tonight's lecture, were investigated. Arnold Schoenberg, for example, was dismissed as a lecturer in composition at the Prussian Academy of Arts. The painter Max Bechmann lost his position as a professor at Frankfurt's Stadelschule. Numerous orchestra musicians, actors, opera singers, and other artists, or those who taught art, experienced the same fate. One exception was made, but only temporarily because of the intervention of Hindenburg, of soldiers who had fought in World War I or had lost a relative in World War I, who had won medals in World War I fighting the British or French. But that law initially affected a few people, and that later was actually revoked as well. In 1933, therefore, around 2,000 civil servants, and by the way, 700 university lecturers lost their jobs and a stroke. There was no appeal, you just lost your job. You were out of a job. However, in what I call a preemptive disobedience campaign conducted by those who were fearful, many Jewish employees were further dismissed from their position in private enterprise and in the arts business. That was the first piece of legislation. Now, one of the first things the Academic Assistance Council did was to find out who. And interestingly, in the archives here at the LSE, which I've got a fantastic amount of material on this, particularly relating to Beveridge, which I've looked through in some detail, and it's wonderful working in that archive. Just reminds you what you are to be a proper academic, once again. They've got the list here, which I think is quite both moving and shocking, but revealing. This is a list of all those academics in universities. We're not talking here orchestras or art, but the university academics. Between April 4th and May 15th, 1933. And the quote here, this is from the AAC archives, the list includes full professors, extraordinary persons named are actual professors. The list is known from other information. It was later published, by the way, in The Guardian, in Manchester Guardian, I suppose, on May 13th, but appears in substantial agreement. About 21 universities were purged. This included Berlin University, Bonn University, Breslau University, Frankfurt University, Göttingen, Halle University, Heidelberg, the great oldest German university, Jena, Kiel, Cologne, Königsberg, Marburg, Mannheim Commercial High School, Königsberg, Hanover, Braunschweig, Aachen, Berlin again, Berlin, Tübingen. It was very thorough. There was very thorough research done to define who could be expelled. And the list, by the way, is extraordinary. It contains about nearly 500 names. I won't give you them all because it would take too long. They include economists, dentists, art historians, tubercular research, chemists, somebody teaches Celtic philology, mathematics, gynecology, medicine, dentistry, psychopathology, law, philosophy, law, metallurgy, economics, sociology, economics, chemistry. It includes Karl Mannheim, Hugo Sinzheimer, Max Horkheimer. It includes both Marxists and liberals and conservatives. They could be anything they wanted politically, but they were Jewish, and they were out. It's an extraordinary list of some of the greatest academics then working in German universities at the time. And this is a very important document because it was this document, or the list of names which appeared in a newspaper when Beveridge was in Vienna, and I'll tell the story in a moment. He saw, and it was this list really which precipitated him to set up the Academic Assistance Council once he got word of this when he was down in Vienna. Now, obviously the Assistance Council could not alone deal with such numbers, so there were 500 straight from the very beginning. By the way, immediately this set panic up amongst a lot of Jewish people in Germany. 34,000 left in 1933 and 34. Most of them to other European countries. And many of them were hoping that this was just a temporary aberration. It's kind of an interesting story. It's a tragic story too. They thought this was a temporary moment. Germany had lost its mind, but this little corporal would one day be removed by the establishment and would get back to some kind of normality. There were many who felt that, and one could understand why they felt that way, and said, responded to it. Not by everybody leaving, but a number did leave. They went mainly to European countries, in the hope of going back within a short space of time, once the madness had passed. But as we know, the madness did not pass. The council set itself not the task of dealing with all expelled people from Germany, but only with the academics and those in the profession of the university. They were very specific about that. They couldn't deal with everybody. What they would do would focus specifically and only on one particular group of people in the name of academic freedom. But how did it come into being? This is an interesting story which I've done quite a lot of research on. Well, this actually, like in all historical events, there's always two versions of the events. Nothing historians like more than disagreeing, even about something as sensitive as this. There are two versions of it. One provided by Beveridge himself, which is not entirely inaccurate, I'll be perfectly honest. And Beveridge, I want to make clear here, went on to play an absolutely formidable role, there's no doubt about it. But there's also something in Beveridge's account which leaves somebody out, which is Zilliot. It's quite interesting looking through the material. I don't want to make much of this, but it's at least worth thinking about how people come to later recall or write about their own histories. The details about this need not detain us too long. They're worth repeating. Now, the Beveridge version can be found in his book. He wrote a 1959 book. It's quite a good book, actually. It's rather good. It's got some good information. It's called A Defense of Free Learning. It's a moving book. It's a very powerful book. There's much in it from which we can learn. What does he say in the book? And he also repeats it, by the way, in his own autobiography, but not in so much detail. This is what he says. I was in Vienna with Lionel Robbins. You know, Lionel Robbins, the man who's given his name to the library and all that. Of course you do. Professor of economics here for over 30 years and a powerful force at the LSE before and after the Second World War. I was there with Robbins, and of course, typically Beveridge, I was doing research into the history of prices. This was a book, by the way, he never finished. But he was down in Vienna with Robbins, and of course, both of them enjoyed Vienna very much. Beveridge had been there after the First World War, looking at the terrible social conditions there. He knew Vienna quite well, and both, of course, were fluent in German. We were in a hotel talking. Then a known Austrian economist to them, a man called Ludwig von Mises, part of the Austrian School of Economics, came in bearing a newspaper. And in that newspaper he said, here are the names of those who've just been dismissed from German universities. Beveridge was shocked, taken aback, as indeed was Lionel Robbins. he continues, just briefly, I returned to London and the LSE. I then, when I got back to the school, travelled to Cambridge to stay with the great liberal historian, and very great liberal historian he was too, George Trevelyan. And he also met up with Frederick Gowland Hopkins, who had won the Nobel Prize in 1929 for his work on vitamins, as well as Lord Rutherford, later to become known as the father of nuclear physics in this country. According to Beveridge, that weekend, when he went up to Cambridge and met these two gentlemen, was when the AAC, the Academic Assistance Council, was conceived, with Rutherford as its first president. The Royal Society was then pulled in. Here, the AAC established its first offices, and on May 24th of that same year, the AAC was announced in the London Times and in all good British newspapers. And there were 43 signatories of the very great and the very good of British academia, including Lord Keynes and many, many others besides, who signed it. And the first meeting was then held at Burghley House on the 1st of June. Now, none of this is untrue. As we shall see, and I'll emphasise the point time and again, Beveridge was extraordinarily important in making the AAC happen. As Ralph Garendorf, the biographer of the school, pointed out in his formidable history of the school, this was Beveridge's finest hour, in many ways. This was Beveridge's finest hour. He rose to the occasion and he rose to the challenge. And he showed both great energy, vision, and humanity in doing so. Yet, there is no mention of one of the other people who played a role, Leo Szilard. The remarkable, as I've said already, Hungarian scientist living and working in Berlin in early 1933. Szilard was a brilliant man, where the word brilliant doesn't do adequate justice to his intellect, and also his political acumen, by the way. He was a very political person. Came from a very rich family as well, which made life a lot easier because he could move around Europe rather easily. As soon as Hitler came to power, Szilard saw the writing was on the wall, straight away, on the 1st of January. He didn't hesitate. He went to a number of his friends, Michael Polanyi, the mathematician, who was, by the way, the brother of Karl Polanyi, the sociologist. He said to Michael Polanyi, get out. Polanyi had just been offered a job in Manchester. And Szilard said, take it. Polanyi, like many at the time, hesitated. He said, oh, I'm not sure, leaving home. This is a huge, huge wrench for any human being, people say. And a home that he had loved in a country that he had hitherto admired. He also added that it would make his chest go back because Manchester climate was known to be terrible. Szilard said, forget it, just go. He didn't go straight away. He went later on. It was later said that Hitler cured Michael Polanyi's chest problems rather quickly. Polanyi saw the writing on the wall within weeks when the Reichstag fire happened, followed by the Reichstag fire decree, which essentially closed down democracy in Germany completely. This was the beginning of the end, he says. And he sensed it straight away. He got as much money out of his bank account as he could, hopped on a train down to Vienna. By the way, NSDAP, Gestapo were already working the trains to make sure people weren't escaping, by the way. And he got to Vienna finally. Here he met friends, one of whom made the quip, which is, in a sense, kind of sharp, just kind of cold humour, but I think you'll understand what he meant. He met one of his friends, who was Jewish, by the way, who made the quip concerning the Jews now under threat. And his friend said, and I'll repeat it here, the French would pray for the victims. The British would organise their rescue, and the Americans would pay for it. I thought it was a rather interesting observation. Actually, it turned out to be somewhat true. As we now know, by coincidence, Beveridge and Robbins also happened to be in Vienna at the same time. It was a coincidence. Szilard met them, and according to Szilard at least, it was he, Szilard, who now urged Beveridge to create a refugee settlement committee back in England. Beveridge, in turn, encouraged Szilard to prod him, Beveridge, when he, Szilard, was back in London. And prod him he did. More than that, according to his biographer, it's a very fine biography of Szilard, it was then Szilard who proposed and began on his own to organise what became known as the AAC. So you've got two versions. However, here's the connection. Zilliot was an outsider. He was an outsider, and he knew it. And he said quite clearly it needs somebody on the inside of the British establishment, not somebody on the outside like me, gadfly, brilliant though I may be. Someone with all the contacts in all the right places. And Zilliot was an outsider. And he confessed in a letter to Beveridge, whom he admired, by the way. There wasn't any animus between the two men. He confessed in a nice letter to Beveridge, and I thought it was a wonderful understatement. Knowing who Zilliot was, by the way, you know how powerful this letter is. He said, I lack in knowledge and experience of the English way of doing things. And I think that was a brilliant kind of observation. So he played a major gadfly role. This doesn't underestimate and take away from the role of Beveridge Plan. It's interesting, however, to find two rather different accounts, and there's discussions as to why that may be so. However, Beveridge was very English, very British, very well connected. And one of the first things he did when he got back to the LSE, which I always thought was remarkable, amazing and wonderful, he discussed the issue with colleagues at the school, at this school, and then asked for voluntary contributions from members of staff. 3% from professors, quite right, 2% from senior lecturers, and 1% from ordinary lecturers. None refused, as far as I know. Great act of solidarity. But it would never be enough. Something bigger was required, and something was to become the Academic Assistants Council, whose first appeal was made public on the 22nd of May 1933. It's worth looking at the appeal. It tells us much about what it did say and what it didn't say. What it did say was that something would have to be done to offer employment to these men and women, there were some women, but not many, but there were some, who had, quote, been obliged to relinquish their post in the universities in Germany. They certainly have. It also said that its own means were limited for the task ahead, and that it would be making an appeal from the universities in the UK. But it added it would welcome economic and financial support and offers of jobs, or at least temporary jobs, from all quarters and also from as many universities in as many other countries as possible. It wasn't just a British thing. In essence, what the AAC was doing, and would do for the next 3 years at least, would in effect function as a fundraiser, a stimulant to encourage others to act, and a clearinghouse and a centre of information, and a vital role it played. But significantly at this stage, at least in the first statement, and one can understand why, we're only talking within weeks of Hitler coming to power, and nobody quite knew where Germany was going to go, and nobody, of course, at this stage had foreordained the Holocaust or anything like that. They actually said some things quite interesting, which I suppose hindsight looks maybe different, but at the time was understandable. Our actions, it said in the first statement, implies no unfriendly feelings to the people of any country, and implies no judgment on any forms of government. The first public statement was not, as one would call it, a protest letter. In fact, again, Beveridge, in his typical way, came up with a wonderful phrase. He said, protest butters, no parsnips. Protest butters, no parsnips. I love that one. Very English, isn't it? The letter was also making it very clear at the very end. It's quite interesting what they said at the end, too. This is an interesting one. And again, I thought about this when I was doing the research for this paper, and I'm going to publish something on this, of course, when I've done all this work. The letter also made it clear that the issue raised by what's going on in Germany was not a Jewish one alone. Many who have suffered have no Jewish connection at all, it went on. Although the overwhelming majority of people are being expelled from universities, including Jews, though by no reason. Now, the last point was a delicate one. Indeed, the newly formed AAC was from the outset careful to emphasise that its primary purpose was to, quote, relieve suffering and defend learning and science in general. And there was, in its view, a good pragmatic reason for doing so. A fear, I believe. A fear that if it did focus on the fact that the vast majority of those it was helping were Jewish, this would, in their view at least, only arouse a dormant anti-Semitism which lay just below the surface of British public life. Indeed, so sensitive were they to this that all the main officers heading up the AAC had what might delicately be described as very British names, and for a good reason. Even Esther Citizen, as an extraordinary, this was a piece of research I kind of dug out, looking through the depots and how people change their names. Even Esther Citizen changed her name around this time in 1933. Fascinating. From what it had been, Esther Citizen. She was born to a Leeds Jewish family. There was a large Jewish community in Leeds and in the north of England, of course. And to what she became known as thereafter was as Esther Citizen, and she never went back. But again, it tells you the sensitivity. Of course, Esther Citizen went on to play such a vital role in the work of the committee, and well after Beveridge had left the stage and many others had moved on to other things. The AAC set about its task with gusto and purpose, and the job it did was a vital one. There's absolutely no doubt about it. As Ralph Cohen has noted in his excellent article on Britain's rescue of academic refugees, the British response to the challenge was pivotal. And the AAC played its part right at the centre of this effort. As two Americans involved in rescuing academics and scientists from Germany and later Austria have noted, no praise can be too high to give to this distinguished body of British scholars and men of affairs for their increasing efforts on behalf of the German professors and later the Austrian ones who had lost their careers and their livelihoods. As Dougall and Drury, the two writers, go on to point out, a good deal of the work done in the US later, and it was some good work done there, no doubt, in rescuing academics was largely done through big philanthropic organisations like Rockefeller and wealthy Jewish philanthropists. And Jewish organisations, of course, played a vital role in the wider rescue mission in the UK, at least, of course they did. But there was no equivalent to the AAC. It was unique. Others tried, but it was unique. Nor did the task facing the AAC get any easier as time went on. On the contrary, the job moved from being urgent in 1933 and 34 to critical after the passage of the Nuremberg laws of 1935 to absolutely desperate by the end of 1938, following the German Anschluss of Austria in March, followed a few months later by the so-called Kristallnacht in Germany, when synagogues were burnt down, Jews killed, and in turn in large numbers. The number of all Jews and others, not just academics alone, trying to get out of Germany and now Austria rocketed. Those who might have earlier hoped that things would or might return to normal, Germany was after all the home of Schiller, Beethoven and Goethe, now had their hopes dashed. Escape was the only option. And as more sought to get out, the job of the AAC became even tougher. More money was needed, more organisation was required, and here, by the way, Esther Citizen played an absolutely vital role with her friends and colleagues. So much so that in 1936 it was decided to change the name from the AAC, the Academic Assistance Council, to what became known as the Society for Protection of Science and Learning. Let's give its acronym SPSL. The SPSL did the lion's share of the work now in providing initial support for displaced academics. Many of these found work in the UK, if only temporarily, though through the work of the SPSL, many also found work in the USA, South America, and indeed even in China. By June 1939, about £100,000 had been donated to the Society. By the outbreak of the war, a few months later, the SPL alone had aided at least 900 scholars to get out, on top of those who had gone before and helped by the AAC. But in spite of all this effort, escape either for academics or indeed anybody else was not easy. The stories you read they're both moving, sad, and tragic. The Nazis more or less stole everything from those seeking to get out. You lost everything. Nor were other countries, and let's be clear about that, countries outside Germany and Austria which had not yet been taken over, liberal democracies, nor were they so keen to welcome what in effect were Jewish refugees from Nazism. FDR, to his credit, hosted or at least convened what was called the Evian Conference, in 1938 to discuss the crisis and hopefully help sort it out. Nothing happened. It only ended up with even more restrictions being put up to immigration from both Germany and Austria. Richard Evans, one of the great historians of Nazi Germany, has pointed out. It was worse after the early end, not better. Only one country actually signed up to the protocols, which was the Dominican Republic. Meanwhile, the AAC and its successor, the SPSL, continued working, though they faced enormous obstacles. I've told so far what might be a kind of positive story about their role, but they faced enormous obstacles at home and abroad. Some, for instance, argued that an influx of well-qualified academics from Germany would only be taking away jobs from other people. Competition from jobs. And there were so few jobs to go around in the 1930s. This was, after all, the moment of the Depression. To take one example, which may sound a bit strange, but it's an important one, according to one very reliable source, there were 16,000 unemployed musicians in England in the 1930s. 16,000. So they were not keen to see an influx of even more musicians, generally very good ones, competing for scarce jobs. Defence of professional privilege was also something the committee and the SPSL also confronted, notably from the doctors and dental associations. As Walter Adams, who later wrote about this moment in his life in the 60s, said, when he was by then director of the LSE, wrote, "Until the war," wrote Adams, "the medical profession maintained a successful opposition to the admission of refugee doctors to practice. Only during the war, when the necessity grew, did they then kind of lower the bar, if you want to call it." And by the way, the City of London denoted hardly anything. This was a constant moan by Beveridge. The city's got stacks of money. Where are they going to give it? They didn't give it. They gave hardly a sou. That's an interesting story. You can actually read this in Adams's Refugee Scholars of the 30s. Then there was officialdom itself. And this was, what was true of Britain was also true of the United States, by the way, so I'm not making this particular point either for or against Britain, but it's an important point to make. There was officialdom itself. Here the story told as to whether Whitehall facilitated or hindered entry into Britain in the 1930s as a complex. It very much depends on who you read. Earlier work by writers like Sherman insists that official Britain did a pretty reasonable job. It didn't make life more difficult to get in. It didn't pass new laws to stop people getting in. And in the end, over 50,000 people got into the UK. Not all academics, of course. As well as the 10,000 children in 1938, the so-called Kindertransport. Yet, as Louise London, in a wonderful book, has pointed out in her later work, Whitehall and the Jews, published in 2001, Whitehall could have done a whole lot more. It was hampered in her view, by fear of émigrés becoming an economic burden. Heard that one before? By its own prejudices. Heard that one before? And of course by a desire, this was an important strategic question, not to upset the situation in the Middle East by facilitating Jewish emigration to Palestine. In the end, of course, 60,000 Jews did get to Palestine in the 30s, but that was done through a deal between the Zionist, one of the Zionist organisations in Germany and the NSDAP, which was very controversial, by the way, amongst many of the Jewish organisations at the time. Even dealing with the Nazis was considered to be, non grata, but they did this to get them out. Moreover, officialdom, according to Louise London, and it's true, having done the minimum in her view, officialdom in 1940 did something even crazier. Several thousand escapees from Nazism were interned. Let's not forget that particular moment in history. Many of the most brilliant scientists and academics now working in Britain were interned. Many went to the Isle of Man, although somebody's pointed out it wasn't so bad on the Isle of Man because they stayed in bed and breakfast, not in internment camps. Some were actually shipped off. I don't mean this negatively about Australia and New Zealand, but it was a long ride to go there. Some ended up there. And by the way, one of those who was interned on the Isle of Man, and you can read this in his wonderful memoirs, is one of the great LSE figures, Klaus Moser, who had got out of Germany and come to the LSE. He was one of them, by the way. Many, many others besides. He described what it's like this extraordinary group of people, thousands of them, sitting around discussing politics, theories of literature, and various other things. It was like a university, but much better than most universities at the time, I would imagine. And many of them in the end did get back in some way or another after appeals and various other things. Not all, but many did. But it wasn't a pleasant experience. Now, mention of Klaus Moser, by the way, who went on to become Professor of Social Statistics at the LSE, and later Director of the Central Statistical Office under Harold Wilson. Although he faced quite a lot of discrimination in the 50s still, by the way, he was still regarded almost as an enemy alien. It's kind of remarkable, given the enormous contribution that he made to British life and to the LSE. Raises the crucial question: who lost, who benefited from the appalling consequences of Nazism in Europe, and in Germany in particular? It almost seems bad taste to raise the question, I thought, but the point needs to be raised. First, who lost? Clearly all those who were forced to leave. All refugees on the end reluctant to leave their country. It was true then, it's true now. And who lost, of course? Most obviously, Germany. But who benefited from what two authors, Jean Medawar and David Piper, called Hitler's gift? Great book, by the way. Hitler's gift to the rest of the world. Well, the rest of the world benefited, especially the UK and the USA. But other countries benefited too, including, interestingly, which is something I've again discovered in the process, for Turkey. Ataturk was very open to immigration of Jewish people to secular Turkey. He wanted to boost Turkish universities. And a number of Jewish scientists and others, academics and others, went to Turkey and may have created the foundation of the Turkish education system for the next 25 or 30 years. They were keen to strengthen their university by opening their doors. By the way, just one figure: of the 1,500 academic refugees in total, the figures vary, by the way, it could be 2,000, it could be 50, but of those total number of academic refugees who left Germany and Austria, 15 went on to win Nobel Prizes. How many went on to become members of the Royal Society or fellows of the British Academy? It's an extraordinary, rich vein of people who came out, forced out, came to Britain and to the United States. His subsequent contribution to British life, science, was just extraordinary. Extraordinary. But let's look specifically at the UK. Just a few examples of what the UK gained from Hitler's gift. In the wider world of culture, Ernst Gombrich, art history. Architecture, Nicholas Pevsner. And in philosophy, of course, later, Karl Popper. Somebody once said the three greatest Englishmen he'd ever met were Ernst Gombrich, Nicholas Pevsner, and Karl Popper. I think it's a wonderful statement. The Warburg Institute, the wonderful Warburg Institute, was another one of Hitler's gifts in 1933. It was shipped over in 1933. There's a picture of the boat coming across the North Sea. You can see David Snowman's book on this, The Hitler Emigres, the cultural impact on Britain of refugees from Nazism. The LSE was a beneficiary too, I've got to be local. Apart from Moser, who came earlier, and Popper, who came later, via New Zealand, there was Michael Zander in law. His father was forced out in 38, 39. Sir Otto Kahn-Freund in labour law. Hersch Lauterpacht, who had come earlier, in international law. Hermann Mannheim in law, and of course Karl Mannheim in sociology, who never got a full-time job, unfortunately. The LSE might have also acquired, this is kind of a little footnote on all this, you might find interesting. The LSE might also have acquired one of the biggest libraries of radical and Marxist literature from Frankfurt, from the Frankfurter Schule, Max Horkheimer and others. Beveridge was keen, he's already about to sign the agreement, about 33, 34. But the more conservative Robbins objected on the grounds that it might reinforce the widely held view at the time that the school was full of Reds. So we didn't get the Frankfurter Schule library, which I think was a great show. What about the scientists, about which much has been written? As Medawar and Pike point out in some detail, the refugees to Britain made major contributions, particularly in the field of physics. 21 leading scientists in all, including Erich Schrödinger, Sir Francis Simon, Rudolf Peierls and Max Born, but also in biology and chemistry, Wilhelm Feldberg, Hermann Blaschko and Max Perutz. Moving on to the United States, over 90,000 emigrated to the US by the start of the war. Actually, a smaller portion, by the way, that we came to the UK, and there's interesting reasons as to why that happened, but that's another story. And a proportion of those 90,000 were academics. But a small minority of those academics were some of the leading scientists in the world and been working on certain areas and in certain fields, which made a huge difference to international history. Firstly, Zilliot himself, who worked out the idea of a chain reaction, by the way, up at near Holborn Station. So it's a wonderful story, how he's walking across the road, Southampton Road at the top there. The lights are going green, red, orange. He's trying to work it out. He was very annoyed with Rutherford at this stage. And Zilliot's way of working was sitting in the bath for 3 hours, thinking, which I think is an excellent way of doing work, actually. I'd rather like to do that myself sometimes. And he's walking down the road, coming out of his hotel up on one of the squares there, and he's suddenly got this idea. He said, we can have a chain reaction. And then he works it through in his own mind. And of course, that's the beginning of the splitting of the atom. Of course, many, many other scientists contributed. This is a fantastic story about Zilliot, who later went to the United States. He, of course, worked alongside Robert Oppenheimer, head of Los Alamos, who, by the way, had worked under Max Born in Göttingen in Germany, although Oppenheimer himself was born in America. He did a lot of his original scientific PhD work in Germany, because that's where you did it. That's where you did it. American universities this time were pretty behind, a long way behind the German universities, and in science, by the way, also behind probably a large number of British universities like Cambridge. And of course, there was Einstein. And they, in turn, knew many other scientists working either in the US or more often than not outside, including in the UK. It was an international group of people, and in Denmark, the wonderful, extraordinary Niels Bohr. If you've seen the play of Copenhagen, I'd really recommend it to see it again on that story. The fight between Niels Bohr and the German scientists at the time. And they were all well aware of the implications of their research for the outcome of the war with Hitler. They didn't like the ethical consequences of what they found out. I mean, this is the point. Many of them said, if we can develop this in the way in which it's developed, many, many other things had to happen. Of course, the enormous industrial investment in Los Alamos, employed 40,000 people, etc., etc., etc. Many, many other scientists became involved in that, of course. It took a long way to go. But many of them knew what the consequences were, as indeed was said in the famous letter of 1939. The consequences of this is a bomb of a size and a scale and a scope and of devastating consequences that we have to worry about the ethics of it, but we have to worry too that Germany might get it first. And that was their real concern. And that letter went to Roosevelt. It then went through an enormous amount of bureaucratic fighting at the time. But we know what finally happened in America, leading finally to the development of the atomic bomb, the winning weapon at the end of World War II. Germany had seen, in spite of Heisenberg, who strikes me as an absolutely appalling human being, I have to say, I've read about him, absolutely appalling. He actually said once, I want Germany to win the war so the Allies don't do bad things to Germany, which is kind of problematic for me, I must say. The story of the making of the bomb in the US has been told many times before. To call it a Jewish bomb of some is absurd, but one would have to argue that the atomic bomb was another one of Hitler's gifts. Not one that some of the scientists liked, by the way, including Oppenheimer and Zilliot, who have very great problems. My narrative ends here. There's much more to tell, and others have told it better and in more detail than I. But it's a story worth telling, I think, and retelling again and again and again. Why? 3 reasons. First, for what it says about the fourth director of the school. What about the school? Let's be fair, Beveridge was not a perfect human being, none of us are, and you may have forgotten to have mentioned Zilliot. On the other hand, there's no doubt of his formidable role. Setting up and pushing the AAC along shows Beveridge at his best. He revealed that same humane side, in my view, a few years later when he published his report in 1942. I kind of see a connection between the two. Second, we need to be reminded of the story because the problem of persecution and displacement of people in general has not gone away, nor have attacks on academic freedom come to an end either, as everybody in this room knows. And finally, there's a simple lesson to be learned, a human story. That if we help strangers, we not only prove our own humanity, but we might also be helping our own societies to become stronger, more resilient, and more culturally and economically dynamic. Yes, this stranger can very soon become today's active citizen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope that you'll be able to take some questions.
Oh yes, lots and lots, please.
Excellent.
Please.
So there are two microphones which Indy and I are going to walk around with. So do ask questions if you would like to. Please go ahead.
You should introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Stephen Wordsworth. I'm the director of what is now CARA, the Council for Risk Academics. Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. I was very pleased to hear when you were going to be doing this. Of course, the story goes up to the Second World War, but it didn't stop there. The SPSL continued working through the war and after. The threat of Nazism clearly vanished, but then the Iron Curtain came down, academics were being forced out of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, and over time, to the 50s and 60s, the focus broadened to cover South Africa under apartheid and South American countries under juntas and so on. In 1999, the name was changed yet again. We've changed our name far too often for our own good. It is now CARA, which stands for the Council for At-Risk Academics. And just as in 1933 it was a rescue mission, we are still a rescue mission today, focusing particularly on people who are still at immediate risk in their home countries, with a network of 120 UK universities, including, of course, the LSE, who provide funding and places for people who need to get away in a hurry. They come here on regular visas. Most are academics at postdoctoral level. Some are still doing PhDs. But they're all taken care of, brought here, helped to settle, to achieve their academic potential, with the idea that one day we hope they can return home. And currently our source countries are mainly in the Middle East, Syria particularly recently, obviously, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Yemen currently, but also other parts of the world. We've got 25 source countries currently in total. And we are very grateful for all the support we get from the academic community here in the UK. I've brought a few copies of our latest annual report with me, which I'll put on the table at the end. Please help yourselves. Or if you want to download a copy, our website is caro.ngo, and you can find it there. But thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Well done on your work. The work goes on. It goes on. Okay, take some questions now. Anyone wants to start?
Thank you very much. I'm a professor from China, and as I have told you, I attend your every lecture. Okay, two quick questions. First is that is the academic AAC a part of the LSE now, or with Windows?
Oh no.
Okay. The second is that I think that you mentioned that it's part of China. I didn't hear it clearly. Is it that some of the donation from China or the donation help some people from China?
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, the AAC was actually wound up effectively in 36, 37 and segued into what I call the SPSL because the job facing is just too big and the money you required was much too great. And the AAC, or what it is now, it's now morphed into something else, now morphed into CARA. And congratulations on the work you're doing. So important to continue this work. It's not an historical question. Maybe the terms of it have changed somewhat because it was so brutal in the 30s, but there's a lot of academics today in need of our help and support, as we've seen recently in Turkey and many, many other countries in the world. And the work we have to do. But no, it is no longer part of the LSE. I mean, the only thing is that by coincidence, and whosever story you want to believe on this one, or whichever version of what I think is both true stories, really, there is a story to be told about the role of the LSE because of one particular director called William Beveridge. Now, it could be that another director would have played exactly the same role, but it says a lot about William Beveridge, and it says a lot about the LSE at the time. I mean, the fact that you could ask professors for a 3% kind of tax on their salaries, I think was kind of pretty good, and 2% and 1% going down. And I've been through many of the letters in the archives on this, just to bring a bit more detailing, because I couldn't do it all in the lecture. I did enough, I hope. But, they're extraordinary letters, and what an energetic person he was. I mean, he makes you tired just reading the letters. I mean, he's writing to people, he's pleading with people, he's receiving letters. There's a wonderful, I've got a series of letters, I won't try and quote from them directly. He's got a letter from a very junior lecturer in a very, marginal university in Germany. And it's a sad letter. He said, I'm a Jew, I'm a teacher in international law, and can you get me something? Because they couldn't get everybody out. And Beveridge asks around in the law department, and a message comes back. And I understand why. I said, look, A, he's not senior enough, he's not well known enough. And there was a sense in which I wouldn't say cherry pick, that would be a very unfair word to use, but if you were already a Nobel Prize winner in Germany, you had a pretty good chance of being saved. You know, and the more senior your university or the more prestigious your university, the more likely you were to be saved. There's no doubt about it. And the more scientifically important you were more likely to be saved. There's no doubt about it. Lindemann, who I mentioned earlier on, almost went on shopping expeditions to build up the laboratories which he was working on in cryogenics at Oxford. Now, I don't want to put it in that crude way. I mean, shopping for people sounds awful. But nonetheless, there's no question that, you know, the role it played. And there's many, many other letters dealing with this whole question of how do you organise it. The big question, the big issue is that this country and this director in this particular school at that particular moment in time, with or without Zillot's help and encouragement, nonetheless played the role that he did. And I think it's really important that we often tell a better story about people rather than the more negative ones we can tell about people. Because indeed, if you do read Beveridge's great biography, it's a very fine biography by Jose Harris, you kind of get to Beveridge in the 30s, and it's a pretty miserable story about Beveridge, about how he falls out with everybody at the LSE, he doesn't get on with Harold Lasky, he falls out with Lionel Robbins, his friend at the time, who later became his wife, Jessie Mayer, she's seen as a kind of, terrible person behind the throne and manipulating Beveridge. And this was said in one of our lectures as well. I think there's a very important positive story to be told about Beveridge, which I do want to come back to time and again. And also, I'm pushing the boat out here a bit, I'm pushing the envelope out a bit more. I think there is a connection between the Beveridge's report of 42 and the work he was doing in the 30s. Because you read that report was not popular with a lot of politicians, certainly not a lot of conservative politicians. When he talked about housing, unemployment, education, fear of want, the 5 giants that had to be slain. You read that document and you think, where did this come from? And I think there's a humanity in Beveridge. In many other ways, there's things about his personality, I suppose, that's strange, but all great people have strange personalities, I think I've concluded. But there's something quite amazing about that, and I think also the other thing I want to stress about Beveridge in this, without hero worshipping him, because I don't, but I think there's that important connection between the enormous contribution he made in 42 with his report, and this enormous contribution that he made in the 1930s to saving strangers. And though he did it in the name of science and learning, hundreds, possibly low thousands of academics and professionals were saved, and saved for humanity. And I think, again, that needs to be remembered. These people were of the highest caliber in all levels of economics, physiology, sociology. The list is just remarkable. It is just remarkable. And the contribution of those people made to the life of this country and to the life of the United States, and indeed actually even to the life of Turkey, which I only discovered en route, is quite remarkable. And I think we need to remember that and celebrate that and talk about it and be reminded of it as many times as possible. And the China story is quite an interesting one. They managed to get a number of academics in, I think it was into Shanghai. They said a few, I don't know how many it was, but that number went to Shanghai. But that was about all it was. Numbers, by the way, the larger number of Jewish immigrants and migrants out of Germany, of course, reached about 300,000 or 400,000 in the end. Although, of course, millions were still left in Europe, as we know. And over 150,000 were still left in Germany. We know the tragic consequences of being left in Germany by 1941. And they weren't allowed to leave, of course, by then. And the results of that, of course, as we know, was the Holocaust and many, many other things beside. Over 300,000 to 400,000 were got out. 50,000 came to this country, about 100,000 went to the United States. Actually, several thousand went to Argentina. Many went, 26,000 went to South Africa. So it was a global. But having said that, I said it in my lecture, and I'll repeat it. I think the response by Western liberal democracies was half-hearted, and that's putting it nicely. Restrictions were imposed. Indeed, there's one tragic story, and it's unbelievably tragic. I almost cried when I was reading it. There's a boat with about 400 Jewish immigrants on it. Goes to Havana, can't land. It's stopped basically by the Americans, essentially. But the Havana didn't want to take it. Cubans didn't want to take it. It then goes up to the side of Miami. A US Coast Guard comes out and turns it back. And these 400 men, women and children, not academics, sitting on this boat. They sit on this boat and they can't get in, so they have to go back to Europe. And the story is that about 150 of those died in the Holocaust. And how many acts of anti-Semitism, bureaucratic obstructionism, we don't want them here. Could have done so much more. We did quite a lot. I think the UK can hold its head up a little bit higher than some others in this story. But the stories also, which tell you of restrictions, anti-Semitism, competing for jobs. It's quite a terrible and wonderful story at one and the same time, I think. More questions, please. Sorry, I'm going on too much.
Yes, there's one.
I'm giving another lecture here. Sorry. Hi.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I'm a German citizen, but I've studied in this country. I've been working in this country for nearly 10 years.
Yeah.
And one thing that I probably don't know anything about, but that came about as an idea now, how has Germany done since the Second World War, or even post-1990, since it's reunified, in attracting academics back 2 generations later of kind of a certain diversity?
The simple story is
because
very...
the future matters in a way.
No, it's a fair question. I'm glad you asked it. It's a great question. Well, let me start with Einstein. Einstein just became so anti-German, and anybody who thought of going back to Germany after the war, he just wouldn't talk to them. He really got so angry with them. And Einstein was a hugely influential figure, as you could well imagine. If you developed the theory of relativity at the age of whatever it was, done this huge amount of scientific originality, a genius beyond a genius. And he had such a huge influence on and some German scientists, Jewish scientists, and mainly Jewish scientists, not entirely, but mainly Jewish scientists, did think of going back, and a few did. But the overwhelming majority decided to stay either in Britain or in the United States. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Very few wanted to go back, and also they'd already settled in countries which they had become habituated to and quite liked. If I might also add, the wrench of leaving your country. This is something I think about a lot, not that I've ever had to myself in any real sense of the word. The wrench of leaving your country, imagine it, there's hundreds of thousands of individual stories there. You have to leave. You've got to leave. You've got no choice. You've lost your job. You've got Gauleiters and Gestapo outside. You're having to put a J on your passport. You're having to wear a scarf. You can't sit on a bench. You're spat at in the street. And worse after Kristallnacht. Worse after Kristallnacht. This is just unbelievable stuff. And so you can imagine, therefore, the desire to go back to the country which had done it to them was very, very, very great. In spite of, obviously, the extraordinary change that occurred in Germany, both West and East Germany, I would add here, by the way, after World War II. I don't know quite what happened in East Germany. Is it possible that a number did go back to East Germany, motivated by building a new socialist society? I don't know. Maybe some did, I don't know. We also know there's another story at the end of World War II. Of course, it's the Soviet Union on one side and the United States and the British on the other, hunting for German scientists now. Very few of them now Jewish, of course, hardly any of them Jewish. Looking for scientists who will now help them in the future Cold War. So the kind of thing that's strong. But I don't think many did go back. In terms of the rehabilitation, I don't think there's any doubt. Come on, there's absolutely no question. Germany's role post-Second World War, to me, has been absolutely admirable. Absolutely admirable. Laws against anti-Semitism, even the buying camp, I'm told, is not legal. The compensation paid back to Israel, it will never compensate. The public opinion in Germany, I think there's absolutely no doubt that it's made a huge difference. And it's also helped the democratisation of West Germany in particular. Was I think, part of the rehabilitation process and its relationship with its part. There is, by the way, in Berlin today, a wonderful Jewish museum. It's absolutely extraordinary. And, so that was then and now is now. But no, not very few, as far as I can see, actually went backwards. That was the question you were asking. They didn't know. You can understand why. By the way, very few went back to Austria either, too. In fact, I heard from many, you get kind of little tidbits, I don't know what you call them, little observations, idiosyncratic things. The Austrians were even worse. And there's, when Anschluss happened, somebody once pointed out, it actually wasn't Anschluss of Austria. Austria welcomed Hitler by 1938. They welcomed Hitler. After all, in 1934 they destroyed the left, The workers' movement had been destroyed. The Social Democrats had run Vienna so well, actually. I have to say, I'm proud to say that, being an old leftist myself. But nonetheless, they had run Vienna very well. They were destroyed physically, exterminated, not exterminated, but put into camps. And by 1938, Austria was open for Auschwitz. And in fact, they welcomed, many of them welcomed it. Those pictures you see of Hitler being welcomed into Vienna, Red Vienna, as it was called in 1919, welcoming Hitler, and welcomed into rural Austria. I think that's a welcome mat that's being thrown out to the occupation. And of course, that also threw thousands more academics, far fewer than in Germany, back up into this particular mouse. Yeah. But
I should protect. Very interesting lecture. You talked about how the LSE Beveridge played a leading role. You talked about the anti-Semitism just below the surface in Britain at the time. As you go through the archives and you look at where the LSE was trying to place academics,
yes.
Can you see any patterns there? Is it possible?
Anywhere they could place somebody, they would place somebody.
Is it possible to call out any other institutions and say that institutional anti-Semitism was prevalent here and therefore it was difficult to place people? And I'm guessing it gets too detailed and you say that there's not the data, but within the school, was it much easier to place someone in the law department and not in other departments?
If one looks at the remaking of the law department in the 20s and 30s with Haushaltskanzler, extraordinary number of lawyers. I mean, this wonderful law department, it started very well, I know. But, once you got the quality of people like Haushaltskanzler and Karl Freund, and then all the others who come, the labour lawyers too, by the way, Hermann Mannheim, an extraordinary person as well. So the law department does extraordinarily well out of that. Remember, the school was clearly to the left in the 1930s, as I'm sure you're aware. Not everybody was on the left in the 1930s, including Hayek, and obviously not our friend Lyle Robbins, a great man, no doubt, and he is a great man, and I don't mean that in any sarcastic way. He made an enormous play, and he played a huge role in supporting Beveridge in this endeavour as well. It should also be added, but I think the school played a terrific role. As for other universities, it varied. The more senior, let's be honest, the more senior you were, the more likely you were going to be offered a senior position and a fellowship in an Oxford college or a Cambridge college. And there's no doubt, so they did very. The more senior you were, the more senior you were likely to get a better position and quickly. Because you had here the creme de la creme of much of German academic life. Not everybody was Jewish, an academic and an academic, not all academics were Jewish, but nonetheless it was a creme de la creme. So at one level there's some saying, we can't do it because we don't have enough jobs going around. On the other hand, you get certain visionaries like Lindemann at Oxford say, I'm going to go and get a few more. Because this was a really big way of building up your scientific capacity. Now, I'm not a scientist, Tim, but my kind of general sense is that, what was British, and it was pretty good British science, by the way. You got a Rutherford, A.V. Hill, you got P.M. Blackett, you got quite a lot of, Nobel Prizes in the core subjects, and in the key subjects, chemistry, physics, and the rest. Even before this, but the numbers actually increased there afterwards, and it is quite an extraordinary contribution that they make. And I think the big scientific institutes and universities were very keen to get who they got. Manchester did quite well after it, by the way. I know it's something. Birmingham did okay as well. By the way, one of the great scientific friends went off to Dublin because he couldn't get a job over here. In one of the notes I've read, and I don't mean this as an accurate restatement of what actually happened. I think it's Beveridge who says something. It may have been A.B. Hill, it may have been Esther Citizen, who says, well, London did very well. We put a lot of people around London, not just the LSE, because we didn't do science here, but, UCL at Imperial, and places like that. So I think quite a lot got placements there. Whether temporary, many of them then went on to the United States, but many of them stayed. London did pretty well. And then they said Cambridge is doing quite well. I assume that must be down to Rutherford and others there. They said Oxford needs to catch up. I think there's a kind of statement that I think they didn't use, but it's more or less that kind of Oxford needs to catch up, whereas Lindemann's doing a hell of a lot to try and get. But, you know, it was the 1930s. I mean, you know, putting in the context, the 1930s, very few jobs around. And, you know, so therefore the AAC and others have to be delicately balancing, placing people temporarily, and they place families too, but it'd be temporary in the hope that they could spin that off into making it something permanent. And many of them in the end did, and very few, by the way, were forced to go back. I think that's the one thing the British did do, to be fair to them, however much they may have been bureaucratic and some subterranean anti-Semitism and all the other stuff. Actually, during the 1930s, I think this is a fair point to say, I think it's true, that they didn't want to pass any more laws against people coming in. You know, if you remember the first Alien Acts in this country in the early part of the 20th century were directed against East European Jews. And then there was another Aliens Act, I think just after or during First World War, because of the war emergency. Actually, the Cabinet did discuss this, and it was kind of an interesting debate. It said, well, on the one hand, we don't want to encourage too much. On the other hand, we don't want to appear as if we're being mean and horrible. You know, it was a kind of a decency gene on one side and a kind of pragmatic gene on the other. So we've got to be a bit careful because we let too many people in there. You know, other people will lose their, won't get, you know, they get annoyed, and could it tap into a latent anti-Semitism? And I think that they aren't constantly worried. And it's the old story, is it not? If you let too many of a certain type of people in, you're only going to encourage an anti-Semitism which you want to keep dampened down. It's like the old debate on immigration, isn't it? If you let too many of a certain type in, then it's only going to make people more prejudiced. I've heard that story before, and I'm sure many of us in this room. But it is extraordinary how many got. I'd also have to say that I think I never want to be too critical of the United States, as you know. I'm very critical of Donald Trump, but that's another question. He's not the United States. I think the United States could have done a hell of a lot more. I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, you know, America's always held up as that kind of paradigm. Welcome all immigrants. Look at the words under the Statue of Liberty. By the way, written by a Jewish woman. Wonderful words. But through the 20s and the 30s, a series of alien acts were passed in the United States, which made emigration to the United States even more difficult, much more difficult. And there was quite a lot of prejudice against Jews, and anti-Semitism ran pretty deep in some parts of American society, and that should also not be underestimated. Thanks, Jim.
Can I actually also ask a question?
Yeah.
In coming to this country, I mean, we know that recently questions of visas being extended or not extended have become crucial for academics in this country. When academics came to this country and were invited to this country, did they just have an automatic right of entry?
Well, I've kind of tried
I'm sure this question is very complicated, so I don't want to open up.
No. I'll first of all be honest. I say I have not studied that particular question in much detail, if at all, to be perfectly honest with you. All I kind of get a sense of is that nobody was sent back. I think this gets back to this ambivalence of the official. On the one hand, well, maybe there's too many, and there's unemployment, and 116,000 unemployed musicians don't want another trombonist or another violinist, or whatever, dentists and medics people, quite a professional defence. But it's a kind of weird situation in Britain. Like Britain is a weird country, I think. It's deeply weird. It is a strange country. Wonderful in many ways, but odd in others, I think. And this kind of official, well, we don't want too many, but official, well, we're not going to send them back because we're British. And by the way, I should say this, man, it's not an answer to your question, but it's a thought I meant to bring out in the lecture. There's two wonderful moments in the documents I've looked through. One is a remarkable statement by in the first AAC document when they say the kind of misuse of history. And it's in the document. I kind of fell off my chair when I saw it. It said, in 1453, when Islam invaded Constantinople and turned it, of course, into something else. Think of the thousands of scholars who escaped to the West, and that was the reason we had the Renaissance. It's fantastic. I don't know if it's true, but it's actually, in other words, they saw themselves in a broader civilizational discussion. The West had benefited so much from the actions of others, which had brought to the West so much art and the knowledge, etc., etc., etc. Now, whether that's the cause of the Renaissance or the Reformation, that's another larger question. I think, but that's quite important. Again, it doesn't answer your question, but it's a good story. I think the second point I found, and this is more to the point, if I can remember it, Beveridge, and this gets you back to Britishness. This notion that Britain was ultimately a land of liberty, a land that welcomed, you know, the person who was being discriminated against. I mean, you go back to Karl Marx, for goodness sake. The 1848ers who got out of Germany. You know, all the old revolutionaries who were followed by the secret police all over London. No doubt Marx had somebody on his tail all the time he was sitting in, well, maybe he didn't by that time. He's getting quite old. But this kind of sense that British liberties meant that you had to defend academic freedom. And there was this kind of rooting of the narrative about the defence of these people, of all these people, Jewish or otherwise, within a larger narrative about British freedom. And I think, again, it's easy to be cynical about that, but it's a kind of it's a construction which should be, I think, exploited to the very full, in my view. And Beveridge, again, exploited it to the very full. He said, we are British, and the British, Britain is a land of liberty. Now, of course, that ignores quite a lot of problems with that statement, you know, colonialism, the Irish question, and all sorts of other things. Nonetheless, putting it to one side, I think that was an important narrative for them. And therefore selling, protecting strangers, saving strangers, could be locked into a notion of Britishness and of being British and being in the great tradition of British liberties. And I think that's a very important way in which we should also conceive of how it was sold, not sold, that sounds makes it too instrumental, you know what I mean. On the particular things, I don't think so. As far as I know, once you were here, even if you were kind of, you managed to get by. And you could also, by the way, once you were in, you could go to one of the Jewish organisations, they might be able to help you. You know, they might be able to give you a few pounds, they may be able to give you some accommodation somewhere. The Jewish philanthropic organisations kicked in quite at this time. And Beveridge, by the way, worked very strongly with them, although always keeping it clear that the AAC. But I don't see anybody having been sent back. There may have been, but I haven't found any. And certainly, the worst thing that happens, of course, is not that so much merit, but what happens in 1940 with the internment. I mean, that is the shock. But then, the British state thought France had been invaded, Netherlands has been overrun, Norway's been occupied, etc., etc., etc. We've just got to be damn careful. I mean, it was a panic measure, which I think they also pulled back from rather rapidly as well. Once it became clear that most of the people they were returning were good anti-Nazis, and by the way, very important people in terms of science and education and scholarship.
Thank you. And I think we're going to have to stop now. It only remains for me to say thank you, Michael, so much for this lecture, which has been profoundly fascinating, inspiring, and disturbing all at the same time.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming and for the questions.
Okay.
And again, my thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for sharing. Thank you for coming, everybody.